Today on the 21st show, legal dimensions of the war between Israel and Hamas in Gaza. There have been accusations of genocide and war crimes. Today we're talking with an international legal expert, taking a deep dive into what those words actually mean, how they're being investigated, and what it would take to prove the charges. We'll also talk about calls for divestment from Israel and what Illinois law says is and is not allowable for that.
Some people see this as an armed conflict only, and some people see this as a genocide. And there's not, that those two views are very contested right now in America.
I'm Brian Mackey, and that's all coming up today on the 21st show, which is a production of Illinois Public Media. But first, the news from NPR. From Illinois Public Media, this is the 21st show. I'm Brian Mackey, and our program today begins on October 7th last year.
As we speak, Palestinian gunmen are inside Israeli cities and towns, something we have never before seen on this scale.
Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is holding urgent talks with his top security officials and says Hamas will bear the consequences of its attacks.
There was initially an outpouring of sympathy for Israel, but as the fighting continued and the deaths in Gaza mounted, things began to turn.
According to the Hamas-run Gaza Health Ministry, the death toll in Gaza has now surpassed 20,000 people.
Hunger is in every corner of this besieged territory, the pain visible in the eyes of mothers like Najla, who's helplessly watched her children go hungry for months.
Now, the Israeli government has repeatedly been accused of carrying out a genocide, both in a rhetorical context among demonstrators in America and beyond, and in a legal context in the International Court of Justice. Meanwhile, the International Criminal Court is said to be weighing whether to accuse top Israeli government and military leaders of war crimes. And closer to home, we've seen demonstrations on college campuses across America calling for universities to stop investing in companies with ties to Israel. All those charged words and phrases like genocide and war crimes, they have specific legal meanings. And in terms of divestment, there are constraints in Illinois and elsewhere on just what state institutions can do. Joining me now for a deep dive on all of these issues is Leslie Wexler. She's a professor at the University of Illinois College of Law who specializes in international law. She's also affiliated with the U of I's program in Jewish culture and society. Professor Wexler, welcome. Thank you for being with us.
Brian, thanks so much for having me.
I want to begin by talking about some of the campus protests we've been seeing. There have been these encampments and demonstrations at U of I, Illinois State, the University of Chicago, DePaul, Northwestern. Other campuses have seen, signs and sidewalk chalk, that sort of thing, if not full encampments. A lot of the people who are coming out are calling for their universities to divest from Israel to a greater or lesser extent. This is part of a broader idea known as BDS. That's short for Boycott, Divestment, Sanctions, which is this effort to pressure Israel to change its approach to the Palestinian people, I suppose would be one way to look at it. Another would be to look at it as to say it's an attempt to make Israel almost a pariah on the international stage. The universities have had different ways of responding. Here in Illinois, though, BDS is something that state lawmakers tackled almost a decade ago. And then Governor Bruce Rauner signed into law a measure about BDS in a state government context. Can you talk a little bit about that legislation and what Illinois lawmakers were trying to do?
Yeah, so Illinois is one of, I believe, either 37 or maybe 38 states at this point that have enacted legislation. And across the states, could be legislation, could be an executive order. These acts tend to do one of three things. The first could be just symbolic, so sort of a statement condemning the boycott, divest, and sanctions movement, but not really implementing any requirements into law. The second, which is where Illinois has landed, is with an investment focus. So public investments like state pension funds, either can't invest or must divest from entities that have a particular relationship with Israel. Either it could be that they are Israeli companies, or it could be that they provide equipment to Israel to use in its conflict, etc. Or you could have a contract focus that says the state can't conduct business with entities that refuse to do business with Israel. So if you run a business and you wanted to get a state contract, you would need to certify that you had not divested from Israel, or you would not refuse during the duration of your contract to do business with Israel. And the justification for this legislation has been that either BDS is engaging in either ethnic or national origin discrimination. And so this legislation is necessary to combat that. Or I suppose some states might just say, look, we get to decide how we want to spend our money, and we don't want to spend it on businesses or put our money into investments that don't recognize this relationship.
And you mentioned pensions. That's one of the ways this comes into play is the state invests billions and billions and billions of dollars into the markets, basically, in companies. There was a dust up a few years ago, I remember, over Unilever, which owns Ben and Jerry's. I think Ben and Jerry's ice cream decided to stop selling in the West Bank, so Illinois cut off its investment in Unilever. I don't know if this is outside your area of expertise, but how would this work in a university context, right? I mean, the university has contracts with all kinds of companies that might do business with Israel. Google, we've heard, is talked about, and Microsoft. Obviously, everybody at the University of Illinois uses Microsoft products just about in their daily work. Do you have a sense of how that plays into this state law in Illinois?
I think my understanding is that they're making a slightly separate argument for state universities. So they're not saying state universities, we demand that you violate state law in contracting with, they're saying states, you invest your endowments in a variety of funds, and we don't want you to invest any of that money in a fund that has could be Israeli companies in their portfolio, or it could be companies that provide certain types of equipment to Israel. So my understanding is that the parts that are aimed at college campuses are really about how the college invests its own money and not about who the college contracts with, though I suppose there could be some campuses where they say, if you have, let's say, exchange programs with Israel, we'd like you to shut those down. So it really does vary by campus in terms of what they're asking for. But my understanding is they are largely focused on the university's own investments, similar to the coal divestment movement that has been sort of growing over the last several years.
From an environmental standpoint.
That's right.
Some people raise the comparison with how many institutions in the United States withdrew or cut off investment in South Africa in the 1980s. Can you speak to how that may or may not be apt to the present situation?
Well, I think it sort of depends what your prior is on what you think is going on in Israel. So if you think that this is as clear-cut as the instance in South Africa, then it seems like the same thing ought to apply. You divest in South Africa, you should divest here. If you think it is not the same, so you might think, for example, that there are some legal violations that are occurring, but you think it is not sort of on scale with apartheid in South Africa, then it wouldn't make sense to call for divestment. I think from a university's perspective, I think that they really try hard to sort of maintain stances of principled neutralities and sort of saying we're not going to pick a side in the conflict. But of course, right, many universities did in fact pick a side in South Africa and call for them to end apartheid. And I think what makes this situation potentially different is that some people see this as an armed conflict only, and some people see this as a genocide. And there's not, that those two views are very contested right now in America.
Yeah, I think you've really come to the heart of it. And, we've certainly, let me just share a comment that in an email to the entire campus community. This is from Chancellor Robert Jones responding to one of the demonstrations at the University of Illinois, April 26th, said, quote, "Our community is not responsible for the progression of this conflict, and we do not have the power to end this devastating war, no matter how much we wish we could." That's his, or I guess the official University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign perspective. You raise there the question of, though some people view this not as an armed conflict, but as a genocide. And that's something I really wanted to talk with you about, because this is a word that we've heard it a lot. You see it on signs, you hear it in chants. Even President Biden has been called Genocide Joe by people on the right and the left. We can gauge the sincerity of the people on the right, but in another context. But I digress. What is genocide from an international legal perspective, as distinct from a word that people chant at a protest?
It's a great question. The Genocide Convention, which was adopted in the 1950s, defines genocide as characterized by the specific intent to destroy in whole or part a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group by, and then it sort of lists a number of things that would constitute genocidal acts. So killing its members, or by other means causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, or forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. What makes it different than related crimes such as war crimes or crimes against humanity is that it does have this very high threshold requirement of the specific intent to destroy in whole or in part. And so I think you can have situations where there are widespread civilian harms and deaths without having a genocide. And conversely, you can have genocides in settings where there is no armed conflict at all, in which the government is engaging in these acts against a civilian population, but there is not sort of simultaneous fighting. The convention came into being after World War II, in part as a response, not surprisingly, to the Holocaust, but the scholar Raphael Lemkin, who's really kind of the father of this convention, was a legal scholar who had been really interested in trying to figure out sort of what distinctively had gone wrong in Armenia in the 1910s. And so thinking about what made it distinctive from sort of other crimes and other problems. And so after World War II, he sort of took, with those two examples in mind, this idea that there was a crime. You might analogize it to hate crime legislation in the United States, that there is something distinctively wrong when particular acts are committed with the intent to target in whole or in part people who belong to a group because they belong to that group.
So the intent, the mens rea, the mental state is key. What are some, Pat, you mentioned Armenia. What are some other past examples of maybe confirmed genocides, if you will? Obviously the Holocaust. But and maybe where that notion, people use the term and it's fallen short in terms of the legal.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry to step on your toes there. So it's interesting because the Genocide Convention didn't come into being until after the Holocaust. I think many people think of the Holocaust as sort of the paradigmatic genocide, but that's not how it was prosecuted at Nuremberg. The place where I think of it, or the two places where I think of it, the first is the former Yugoslavia. So The first international criminal tribunal since Nuremberg was the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. And there were over 160 people charged, including heads of state, cabinet ministers, other kind of high-level officials and police leaders, both, or I guess all sides to the conflict had people that were prosecuted. And at the ICTY, one of the things that was established is that in a town called Srebrenica, the Bosnian Serbs slaughtered 8,000 Bosnian Muslim men, and the ICTY, the International Criminal Tribunal for Yugoslavia, determined that the Genocide Convention was satisfied. In other words, that particular event and those who were engaged in it had engaged in the crime of genocide. Another instance in which an international court had found a genocide was Rwanda. And so in the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, there were multiple cases in which the court concluded, based on a sort of a combination of derogatory, dehumanizing language, the systematic manner of violent attacks, kind of a pattern of action, particular weapons used, that there was a genocide there as well. I think sometimes people might think you have to have sort of a smoking gun in which a high-level state official kind of writes on a piece of paper, the reason we're doing all of these things is because we want to destroy this group as such. And while having a sort of a smoking gun memo like that would certainly be helpful in prosecutions, you can look to other sort of indicia of intent. So what are state officials saying about the actions that they're undertaking? How are they characterizing the victims, et cetera, to help succeed in these prosecutions?
All right, we need to take a break. We will continue with Leslie Wexler of the U of I on some of the international legal dimensions of the conflict in Israel and Gaza. This is the 21st show. Stay with us. If you're just joining us, this is the 21st show. I'm Brian Mackey. We are taking a deep dive for the hour today into some of the legal dimensions, the international legal dimensions, accusations of genocide and war crimes against Israel that have come up in its war against Hamas in Gaza.
We start in The Hague, and the International Court of Justice there is holding the first hearing today, where it will consider whether Israel is committing genocide against Palestinians in Gaza.
Lawyers for the South African government have outlined their case to the UN's top court, alleging that Israel's military offensive in Gaza amounts to genocide.
Israel must take all measures to prevent any acts that could be considered genocidal, including killing members of a group, causing bodily harm, inflicting conditions designed to bring about the destruction of a group, preventing birth. So it's not saying you've got to stop your war. It's saying you've got to fight it in a very different way.
My guest for the hour is Leslie Wexler. She's a professor at the U of I College of Law. She specializes in international law. She's also affiliated with the university's program in Jewish culture and society. We taped our conversation yesterday afternoon, Tuesday afternoon, so we are not taking calls for the hour today, but you can always let us know what you think by emailing talk@21stshow.org. That's talk@21stshow.org. You mentioned there was a sort of ad hoc criminal tribunal for Yugoslavia, or the former Yugoslavia. How is there a standing body? How are these things actually adjudicated for future claims? There was some news coverage of, I believe it was the nation of South Africa that brought a charge of genocide to an international tribunal against Israel earlier this year. That sort of thing will take years to determine, I understand. But how are these things adjudicated?
Sure. So there are actually two permanent places right now where these charges are sort of working or potentially working their way through. So the one that you referenced, which is the South African case, is in the International Court of Justice. So the International Court of Justice only has jurisdictions over states. So South Africa is a member of the Genocide Convention, as is Israel, and that is the sort of basis of the claim. Hamas, not a state, not a member of the Genocide Convention. So this case is really focused on Israel's actions, right? Hamas is not a party to this litigation. So the submission from South Africa did a few things. So it really focused on the rhetoric of Israeli officials, the President Netanyahu, other officials who went on international media and sort of explained what they were going to do, how they were going to respond, and the sort of really dehumanizing rhetoric that many of them used. For example, I believe there was an official who said, you know, they're not human, they're human animals, etc. And in combination with focusing on the rhetoric of various officials, they documented, largely using sort of UN sources, various very dire humanitarian circumstances. And they identified sort of a variety of harms that had occurred to a variety of individuals and sort of places to suggest that a genocide was going on. In response, I think Israel, in its response, really emphasized that the South African submission tended in some ways to ignore the fact that an armed conflict was going on. So the South African submission would say, you know, Israel is targeting ambulances or hospitals, and Israel would say, yeah, the reason we're doing that is because Hamas was there, Hamas was shooting at us, it's lawful in armed conflict to respond to those events, even if it is generally unlawful to attack an ambulance or a hospital, etc. So Israel largely was saying, look, this is about an armed conflict. This is not about a genocide. As you say, the ICJ is a very long way away from a decision on the merits. But in the interim, it did something which was to issue what are called provisional measures. And this was really important. In so doing, the ICJ was saying, we think that it is not implausible that Israel has engaged in activities that might do things like constitute inciting genocide or other acts that are problematic. And because of this, we need to act to preserve the status quo. So we're not making a ruling on the merits. We are not saying Israel is genocidal. But what we're saying is we are concerned enough that we're going to sort of issue some directions to Israel. So those directions included that Israel needed to enable provision of urgently needed basic services and humanitarian aid. So for example, letting in medical assistance, letting in water, and in addition to that, doing things like having a viable deconfliction channel. It's a long word. What does deconfliction mean? If you're a non-government organization that's going to get water or food from where you enter Gaza to some particular location, there needs to be a way to communicate with the Israeli military what route you're going to take, make sure that you'll be protected and not attacked on that route, so that, you know, they can establish where you're going to be and be communicating with you and with whoever they need to be to say, you know, don't strike this vehicle on this road. They're going to be traveling at this time. They're going to have this many people with them, etc. They also said that Israel shouldn't be making routine denials of requests to make aid deliveries. So of course, in any given instance, you could have a concern about Hamas, but it can't be a sort of, and that means no aid can get through at all. They also directed Israel to take all measures within its power to prevent the commission of acts of genocide and to ensure that military units don't carry out acts that violate the Genocide Convention. But I want to reiterate, the act itself did not order Israel to desist from genocide or to desist from military operations in Gaza. So the actions were really designed at saying, we don't know whether there is a genocide, but we can't definitively say there is not one. And given the concerns that we have, these are the things that you need to do before we eventually, at some point in time, adjudicate these claims.
This gets in an interesting question, which is what sort of rules of engagement, if you will, and we don't have to get too in the weeds of it, and I don't expect you're necessarily an expert on, Israeli Defense Force protocols, but what sort of rules of engagement should Israel be operating under? Because I can see from one perspective, it's a war, it's a conflict. From another perspective, some in Israel might argue, oh, this is an internal matter. We're dealing with something within our own borders. How do you think of that, or how should we think of that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'm going to just start by saying what rules of engagement are in case some people listening aren't familiar. Rules of engagement tell militaries how and under what circumstances it's permissible to use force during operations. They may also sort of outline what risks to civilians are permissible or impermissible. Rules of engagement should be consistent with a state's international obligations. So Israel has ratified the Geneva Convention, so their rules of operation should be consistent with the Geneva Conventions as they apply to this particular conflict. They could always choose to do more. So, for example, in the War on Terror, there were points in the conflict in which the United States said, we think that the laws of war say we can do X, but our rules of engagement are going to say you can do less than X because we want to be more protective than the law requires us. Of course, the concern here is the opposite. The concern is, well, what if Israel's rules of engagement are allowing it to do less than the laws of war require rather than more? Of course, and I think somewhat unsurprisingly, military rules of engagement are classified. So it's not as though you can sort of get a copy of Israel's rules. And for, I think, good reason. You certainly wouldn't want Hamas to know exactly where they've defined what they can and can't do. They might exploit that in a variety of ways. But I can tell you about a lot of the concerns that have been raised by those who are sort of in the know about this. So one concern is about what constitutes a permissible target. The United States interprets the laws of war to allow targeting what are called war-sustaining targets. So not just combatants, not just military facilities, but also things that provide sort of sources of economic activity that could sustain groups like Hamas, so banks or other businesses. This is a contested interpretation of the Geneva Convention. So Israel also supports this interpretation. Many states do not. And so some of the things that Israel has targeted, they can say, well, we believe this to be lawful, and other states might say, we disagree. Other concerns that have been raised, concerns that commanders may be incorrectly and arbitrarily declaring free fire zones. And a free fire zone is when you say, I am defining everyone within this radius as being a legitimate military target. But it may not, in fact, be true that everybody in that area is a legitimate military target. And you worry, for example, if Israel says, well, we've provided ample warning, we have given leaflets, we've posted on, we've sent notifications to people's phones that we're going to come in and engage in this area and all civilians should leave. That doesn't mean that all civilians, in fact, have left, or it also doesn't mean that any civilian who stays then becomes somebody who is legitimately targeted. So there's concern that that might be happening. There's concern about proportionality, which is, well, there might be instances in which Israel has identified a legitimate target. So somebody who is in the military wing of Hamas, that is someone that Israel is entitled to attack under the laws of war, but that they've decided that they will allow too much collateral damage relative to the perceived direct military gain. So what I've read has suggested that for very low level Hamas military operatives, so kind of think of, your 17, 18, 19-year-old with a gun, is a fighter, but they're not making operational decisions. They're just sort of a low-level person who presents some threat. And they are saying, and we've identified that person, and we can allow up to 15 to 20 civilian casualties in order to take out that one relatively low-level operative. And I want to stress that this is an allegation, right? So there are people who are saying that's what the standard is, but we don't actually know. That's why legal proceedings are so important to find out, is that in fact the amount of collateral damage that they are allowing for low-level operatives? We can't say for sure without sort of getting into the evidence, but that's the allegation. And if it is true, is quite concerning. Other things that are concerning, that there may be using an AI program. So there is a Israeli source called Plus 972 that has been reporting on the conflict since October 7th, and they've reported that Israel is using an AI program designed to sort of identify all suspected operatives in the military wing and then targeting those individuals in their home. What's concerning about this allegation is that they may not really have a good sense of how good the raw intelligence data is, how well the AI is trained. There are suggestions that this program may have a 10% error rate or more. A related concern is that there are allegations Israel is using this program to bomb military operatives in their home. So even though it would be more difficult to catch them at other places and other times, whereas they're sort of coming home at night to sleep, if they are other places, you might be able to minimize civilian casualties, which is something that Additional Protocol 1 to the Geneva Convention requires, that you take feasible precautions in choice of means and methods of attack to avoid and minimize incidental loss of civilian life, injury to civilians, and damage to civilian objects. And that is part of customary international law. I know that's a very long laundry list. There are certainly other concerns as well. But I think that those are the ones that I'm sort of seeing most often in reporting as being distinct concerns about the rules of engagement.
All right, let me take a moment to reintroduce our conversation. We are taking a deep dive all hour today into some of the legal issues around Israel's conflict with Hamas in Gaza. We're talking about the definitions of genocide and war crimes, not just what they mean as rhetorical devices here in America, where we've heard them on campus protests across the country, but also in a specific international legal context. How are they proven? What do they mean? What are the consequences, potentially, for Israel and top Israeli leaders? My guest for this conversation, which we taped Tuesday afternoon, is Leslie Wexler, a professor at the University of Illinois College of Law, also affiliated with the university's program in Jewish culture and society. Because the program's on tape, we're not taking calls, but let us know what you think by emailing talk@21stshow.org. More to come after a short break. This is The 21st Show. Stay with us. It's the 21st show. I'm Brian Mackey. All hour today, we're taking a deep dive into some of the legal issues around Israel's war with Hamas in Gaza and the massive death toll among Palestinian people. Some 1,200 Israelis were killed in the initial Hamas attack on October 7th. Hundreds more were taken hostage. Well, more than 100 are still said to be hostage to Hamas in Gaza. But meanwhile, on the other side, as Israel has retaliated against Hamas, 35,000 Palestinians in Gaza are said to have been killed. Many thousands of those are thought to be Hamas fighters or said to be Hamas fighters, but even many more, tens of thousands more, are said to be innocent Palestinian civilians. We're talking about some of the legal consequences of this and the legal dimensions of it. Accusations of genocide. What does that mean? What does it mean that top Israeli leaders are being investigated for war crimes? We're talking about all of this with an international legal expert based right here in Central Illinois. Leslie Wexler is a professor at the U of I College of Law. She's also affiliated with the university's program in Jewish culture and society. You talk through all these rules of engagement, and we've also talked about international law. Is Hamas constrained or subject to any of these sort of requirements or international standards?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so there is, I think, some dispute about what kind of conflict Israel is having. Is it a non-international armed conflict, or is it an international armed conflict? And the answer to that depends on sort of both whether you view Palestine as a state, but also whether and sort of how you view Hamas's role within it. Is there an occupation or not? But I think that the sort of shorter answer is yes, there are definitely limits on what Hamas can do. The vast majority of countries in the world don't recognize that Hamas would have sort of a right to act as combatants. So they can be criminally prosecuted by Israel for engaging in acts that they are not authorized to engage in. And even if you felt that that was a misinterpretation, that Hamas is entitled to engage in violence, there are a variety of things that they are doing, like targeting civilians, like engaging in indiscriminate rocket firing, using individuals as human shields, hostage taking. All of those things are unlawful. So it's not an instance where you have sort of one actor who's sort of potentially behaving unlawfully and the other one is doing lawful activities. Hamas is engaging in illegal behavior. Now, various groups might disagree about kind of where the source of that illegality is, but nobody, well, I guess I shouldn't say nobody, I think very few scholars would say that it is lawful, for example, for Hamas to do what it did on October 7th, particularly in regards to anyone that was not serving in the Israeli military.
You know, we've been talking about the legal definition of genocide and rules of engagement, and we haven't really gotten into it as much, but, you know, the specter of war crimes prosecution is out there. I think for a lot of people, they think about, to the extent they do think about this conflict, it's, you know, stop killing children and, you know, free the hostages, maybe. That's,
yeah.
Why is it important? Is it important to think through, you know, the actual legal standards at play here, the legal definition of genocide, how that's proven, that sort of thing?
Well, I think why it matters is that is a particular sort of claim when you say a state or individuals within that state are engaging in genocide, that means something as a legal matter, that they are targeting Palestinians as such. And if that is not the case, if what they are doing instead is engaging in an armed conflict with Hamas, then the determination of when it is lawful for Palestinian individuals who are not in Hamas to die, there's a different answer, right? The law says there can be lawful civilian casualties in armed conflict. And so figuring out kind of what makes the deaths of particular individuals lawful or not depends on what crime you are pointing to. But I take your larger point, which is a lot of people are not focusing at all on a legal question. I think for some people, maybe even many people, this isn't about whether it's lawful or not. It's about whether it's moral or not. But I think that looking to the law can help us sort of understand why states have allowed some civilian casualties, but not others. And I think that having a really good, nuanced understanding of what the law permits and what the law forbids can then sort of set the stage to make factual determinations. So just knowing that a lot of people have died in Gaza is by itself not enough to tell us whether there is a genocide, whether there is a crime against humanity, whether there have been repeated grave breaches of the Geneva Convention. Knowing those numbers can lead us in the direction of what is it we should be investigating, what practices should we be particularly concerned about. But we need to know more, right? We need to know, why is Israel doing what it's doing? What rules is it following or not following when it engages in any particular military operation? I think there's a separate question which we haven't talked about too much, which is sort of the provision of humanitarian assistance, which is distinct in some ways, but not in all ways, from the armed conflict. So under the laws of armed conflict, if it is an occupation, you have an affirmative duty to sort of provide for the needs of the people who are being occupied. Israel says, this is not an occupation. We don't govern in Gaza. We're not an occupier. Lots of states, lots of individuals disagree with that characterization. But if they are not an occupier, then the position of the laws of war is, well, then you can't arbitrarily deny others the ability to kind of provide humanitarian assistance. And so in some ways, I think this might be the strongest claim that is currently at the ICJ. And I think if the International Criminal Court, which we haven't talked about yet, if they decided to bring charges, they might want to focus on those claims as well. It's difficult to prove, though not impossible, for any individual attack. Was this attack, this decision to strike this particular building, was it genocidal? Was it disproportionate based on the evidence that you had beforehand about the number of civilian casualties that you could anticipate as compared to the military advantage? Those can be deeply kind of fact-driven, difficult to assess considerations, not impossible by any means. But I think the claims about the arbitrary denials of assistance might provide a different way to pursue criminal charges if, for example, the International Criminal Court decides to hand out warrants, which, the news suggests they're thinking about it, but they haven't done it yet.
Yeah, let's talk. Let me just pause here and say, I know I asked you until 3:00. Do you have another 10 minutes or so?
Yeah, no, that would be fine.
Okay, that'd be great. Thank you. That would pretty much take us to the end of the program then for tomorrow. So let me pick back up where we were then and say, so all right, let's talk about the International Criminal Court. As you mentioned, there's been reporting that they're considering the possibility of war crimes charges against certain Israeli government and military leaders. What would be the significance of that? How would that proceed?
Sure. So in talking about how it would proceed, I'm going to take us back a step and talk about some procedural business that maybe is of interest to no one but me. But so the International Criminal Court has jurisdiction over genocide, grave breaches of the Geneva Convention, crimes against humanity, and the crime of aggression. In addition to sort of the subject matter that it covers, it also needs to have jurisdiction over, for example, Israeli officials if it were to hand down warrants to them. And so the ICC says if crimes were committed either by a state party national or in the territory of a state party or in a state that has accepted the jurisdiction of the court, or they were referred to the ICC by the UN Security Council, then they would have jurisdiction. So the state of Palestine accepted jurisdiction of the ICC, and the ICC found it to be a state party. Now, Israel disagrees that Palestine ought to count as a state or ought to count as a state for
Or say,
purposes
when you
of
say the state of
ICC
Palestine,
jurisdiction.
which governmental body are you referring to there?
Right. So it doesn't need to be Hamas that accepts the jurisdiction because it's just saying the territory. So if the crime happened in the territory that ICC believes to be Palestine and it believes Palestine to be a state who has acceded to its jurisdiction, then it says it has jurisdiction over that. And so assuming that the ICC is correct about that it can assert jurisdiction in this instance, then they could issue warrants to, it could be Israeli officials, for example, or it could even be they could issue warrants against Hamas as well. So one really easy thing they could do is issue warrants against Hamas for hostage taking, right? There's not much of a factual dispute there as to the fact that that has happened. That is a violation of the customary international laws of war. For Israel, if they were going to hand out warrants, the ICC prosecutor in December of 2023 sort of said, look, humanitarian assistance needs to be getting in at pace, at scale. And so that suggested to me that the ICC prosecutor might be particularly concerned with officials who have called for a complete siege on Gaza, maybe against those in the military who are responsible for failing to act against protesters who are blocking aid from going in. I don't know, right? I mean, I don't think we yet have a good sense of what particular crimes the ICC might point to. There have been lots of instances. Think, for example, the attack on the Al-Shifa hospital. They could issue warrants relating to that, or they could decide that's going to be too complicated, that there were legitimate military concerns that were implicated, or even if they believe that what happened was unlawful, that it would be too difficult to prove that it was unlawful. So to me, at least, it's a little bit of a question mark as to what particular events or activities they're going to want to point at, but it does seem like the ICC maybe has been signaling for a while that it might issue warrants here.
Well, Leslie Wexler, it's certainly a complicated subject, and I really appreciate you spending so much of your time helping us think through some of these issues. Leslie Wexler is a professor at the University of Illinois College of Law, also affiliated with the program in Jewish Culture and Society at the U of I. Thank you so much for your time.
All right, thank you for having me.
And that is all the time we have for our program today. I want to urge you to visit our website, 21stshow.org. While you're there, you can find links to some of our past conversations. We've had many conversations on Israel and Gaza now, looking at just some of the basic military and what's been happening. We've spoken with Israelis in Illinois. We've spoken with Palestinians in Illinois about how the war is affecting them. You can find all of that at 21stshow.org. The 21st Show is produced by Christine Hatfield and Jose Zepeda. Our digital producer is Damian Contreras. Technical direction and engineering comes from Jason Croft and Steve Mork. Reginald Hardwick is our news director. The 21st Show is a production of Illinois Public Media. I'm Brian Mackey. Thanks for listening. We'll talk with you again tomorrow.